So I've got a bunch of things I wanted to cover, but I'm going to start with things that aren't on my slides. I want to start with my own reflection and observation on the first year of this committee and on a number of things that the committee did and frankly suffered through and learned from, for which I am personally very grateful. And that may sound a bit perverse, so let me explain. I think with any organization, particularly one like this that has, from my experience, kind of a unique statutory setup, there's going to be not just the usual forming, storming, and norming, but also a little bit of stumbling around to find out, kind of from an existential perspective, why do we exist? Why is it worth your collective time and those of your predecessors to make your way through the god-awful LA traffic when you have day jobs and families and other things to do with your time? What's the value add for you coming together? I will tell you from my perspective, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the executive director over the draft master plan, meaning I heard the cats that are our IPT, the group of VA employees from across this very large agency who all play a role in ensuring that the master plan is implemented. And we, all of us, heard things from this group and from people who are no longer on this group that made our work better. So I know there was some frustration expressed earlier today about how slowly formal recommendations make their way from a group like this to the secretary, such that the solicitation for our principal developer team was already done by the time recommendations to the secretary to change it had reached the secretary, certainly before he had responded. Anne made a reference to my oft-repeated comment. I'm a simple person. There's a few things I just say over and over again. I can't unhear what I heard, and I sat in on all of those meetings and all of those discussions that led to the development of those recommendations, as did Paul and other members of the team who were responsible for the preparation and management of that solicitation process. And real-time changes were made to the solicitation for the better, absolutely for the better, based on the expert input of members of this board. So I'm very grateful that I get to participate and hear you having smart thoughts while I'm busy clocking myself in the bathroom. And then making sure that your expert thoughts make their way into our process real time, even if the formal process for making the recommendations to the secretary lags. So I am very grateful for all of the work that those of you who were on the board last year put in, the work that I know those of you who are new have already put in and will continue to put in, and in particular for the contributions of those who were on the board and no longer are. You have absolutely made us better. So I just wanted to make sure I started with that quickly before I keel over. I also wanted to provide for those of you who weren't able to participate and haven't had an actual readout on the secretary's visit, from my perspective, how incredibly important that was. So last June, I think, maybe it was May, Anne and Heidi Marston and I made our way to DC to try to update those in power, the acting secretary, the acting undersecretary for health, and others about the work on this campus. It is a political reality that oftentimes multi-year projects that are really important start under one administration, become sort of signature initiatives of one secretary. Then the political calendar changes, we have a new president, a new secretary, and it's really anybody's guess whether that priority is going to carry over into the new administration. So we went to DC as supplicants to ask the question, are we still important? Is the work out here? We have a legal mandate. I believe we have a clear moral obligation, but did they feel a political imperative? We got all the right noises from the folks who were there in late May, early June, and then a couple months later, whole new crowd. Nobody that we had talked to was in those positions anymore. So we made the decision to wait until Secretary Wilkie had been confirmed so that we knew the guy we were talking to should have some longevity. And we made our way back. Meanwhile, the General Counsel, Jim Byrne, who was my boss before I came out to take this job, had been detailed, or he was the acting deputy secretary, Jim had already made a visit out here. He had absolutely fallen in love with and established his commitment to the work that we are doing out here. So I knew we had him as a strong advocate. And so we first went back and had an opportunity to do sort of a pre-briefing. We put together materials for Secretary Wilkie. We ran them through his deputy, Jim Byrne, who first and foremost said, there's way too much detail here. Remember, this is a busy man. He's also a student of history. Make sure you're pitching to your actual audience. We cleaned up our act a little bit, went back out, and did a presentation the week before the secretary was due to be here for a day. Wanted to make sure that he hit the ground here, armed with the information that we believed he needed to have in order to take in what he was going to see and hear once he got here. So we did that, got just the most delightful, heartfelt, humble, wonderful commitment from a very humble and wonderful public servant that yes, absolutely, we can't begin to address the issues of veteran homelessness, suicide, substance abuse, mental health challenges nationwide if we don't get it right in Los Angeles. So absolutely got an unequivocal commitment. And I will share, I was trying to be strategic, so I wasn't going to actually ask the question, do we have your commitment, until after we'd done our briefing for him in DC and he came out and spent a full day here. But early on, as it became clear he had already read the massive book that we had put together for him and he began to ask questions, I was feeling lucky. So I told him, sir, I was going to wait and ask this question, but I think I'll just go for it now. And the answer was everything we could have hoped for and then some. So that was in DC. He then came out here and spent a day. To the question about the relationship with UCLA, the first sort of large engagement he had was with the chancellor and a large group of people at UCLA. Absolutely, this secretary, like every other secretary before him, understands that's a special relationship and that the relationship probably hasn't yet been leveraged fully for the benefit of veterans. And so there was a high level and I think initial but very meaningful conversation between the secretary and the chancellor about what else can we do and should we be doing together. And then came back here, had a meeting with Mayor Garcetti to talk about the need, the absolute need for VA, the city, and the county to partner robustly and effectively to address issues of veteran homelessness, substance abuse, the whole 9 yards. Again, really lovely to see smart people with different perspectives kind of all sharing observations about a very thorny, difficult set of issues that will require everybody to be all in to address them. We then took both the mayor and the secretary on a tour of the campus, got to see the site where the temporary bridge housing facility will go in. That's a wonderful partnership between VA, the city, and the county to meet an urgent need urgently. Also got to watch both the secretary and the mayor in action with homeless veterans, both while we were standing outside the hospital waiting to get on the bus to go take the tour. Lots of veterans coming in for appointments, came up, recognized the mayor on site. I don't know yet whether the secretary is quite as recognizable right here in LA as Mayor Garcetti is, but lots of authentic sort of warmth from both the secretary and the mayor toward just vetting veteran who wanted to come engage. Then we went to tour building 209 and that's when the warmth got even warmer. It was just delightful to see the residents there openly sharing their stories and seeing how moved Secretary Wilkie was, who had not heard those stories, I think, quite as often as the mayor, who's been a frequent visitor in building 209, had heard the stories. I lost count of the number of hugs shared. But so anyway, long story short, it could not have been a more successful visit from my perspective, wanting to know that we have the continued support of this administration, this secretary, who are going to need to make the work that we're doing here a priority and resource it accordingly. So really, really successful visit. The next thing I wanted to cover before I even get into my slides is what I expect may be coming this year. This will be a critical year, kind of a make or break year in terms of the work of our master plan. And that is true for a bunch of reasons. we, within the next few days, will be issuing an final environmental assessment. Is that the right term? That's what an EA is? Yes. Which are the documents specific to the environmental due diligence for buildings 205 and 208 and 207. They were handled on a different timetable, started earlier than our programmatic environmental impact statement, in the hopes that we could expedite delivery of that initial phase of housing while also complying with our obligations under the National Environmental Protection Act and other relevant laws. And it is simply a fact that at various points in the lifespan of a federal environmental due diligence process, there are points at which anybody who wants to challenge the sufficiency of the work gets to sue to challenge. The issuance of the EAs for those first 3 buildings is the first obvious touch point at which anybody who wants to challenge the sufficiency of that work can do so through litigation. I'm a lawyer, I'm a litigator, I've litigated a lot in the federal courts here in Los Angeles. It is not to be taken on by those who don't have a stomach for a fight. And it's certainly uncomfortable for those who don't have a high tolerance for ambiguity, because once you get something into the hands of a judge, you're at the mercy of somebody who may not fully understand all of the equities and all of the laws. And we also here in VA, although we have fabulous lawyers, some of whom are in the room, none of whom hit her head in the bathroom earlier today. We have really great, smart legal minds doing our work, but once we get into federal court, it's Department of Justice who handles the government's case. And again, it's a bit of a uphill battle sometimes to get our counterparts at DOJ to fully understand the equities and the laws and the background as well as we do. So anyway, chances are at some point this year, somebody's going to at least be thinking about, if not in fact initiating litigation to challenge the work we've done thus far. And that type of litigation can result in an injunction, which is an order from the court saying, stand down while I, the judge, work out the merits of the challenge and or while something else happens. And so those of you who've heard from me before know that generally speaking, I'm actually able to stand and I'm pretty highly caffeinated and I'm very impatient, and I really, really, really want to get the doors open to a lot more homeless veterans as quickly as possible. So given that part of me, plus the fact that I'm a litigator, it makes me really nervous to think that we could be on the cusp of a judicial process that could slow us down. So just want to flag that because it's one of the things that keeps us awake here. The other thing that is on the cusp this year is the flip side of that, which is assuming we don't get enjoined, we are now poised to begin in earnest a lot of construction that will result relatively soon in the delivery of a lot more units of housing, and that's pretty damn exciting. And you'll be hearing from our principal developer team more specifically about that in a few minutes. So, and then finally, the other thing that is already a priority for us is the implementation of the IG's recommendations in the context of our IG office review of land uses here at the campus. Because of the nature and extent of some of those recommendations, the action plan that the agency submitted back that the IG agreed with was we have until the end of September of 2019 to implement those recommendations. We are actively working to get all of those moving parts both started and aligned with each other. That's going to take a lot of work. We're going to be really busy this year. So I wanted to flag that for this group, both for your awareness and also to kind of reiterate the point that Ann started with, which is I and the IPT members want to continue to be completely transparent, forthcoming, in dancing with you, and we're going to find ourselves a little bit strapped in terms of resources and energy this year. So we want to make sure we're meeting your highest priorities, and that you understand why if you request something and you want it tomorrow, you might have to negotiate next week instead of tomorrow. This year's going to be real busy for us. So with that as my opening statement, can we move to, okay, so This slide is the rosy picture of what we hope is on the near horizon, and that is the operational and near-term housing to be delivered through our EUL process. We all know about Building 209, which opened in June of 2017. The next step in development is Buildings 205 and 208, which should result in the delivery of about 120 additional units. 207, about 50 units. All of those, if all goes well, to be delivered and available for occupancy by chronically homeless veterans in fiscal 2021, different times in fiscal 2021. And then the first new construction is MacArthur Field, and that should trail a little bit thereafter. I'm particularly excited, frankly, to see both of those things happen, because I don't know ultimately how much new construction versus renovation is the right mix on this campus. We have a lot of buildings that are seismically deficient, and so whereas we have some people who tell us that it's going to be faster and cheaper to build new, sure, but we also have to deal with those seismically deficient buildings, and it costs money to tear them down. So to the extent that we can get private sector funding through the EUL program into the mix to do both, by renovating an existing building, that actually may at the end of the day be the more cost-effective solution. Anyway, fortunately we've got the principal developer team has a much better capability of answering that question. What should we renovate? What should we build new? And we're on the cusp of beginning to ask and answer those questions in real time. Next slide, please. So I think I won't steal the principal developer's thunder by talking too much about what their role is, especially since I got started late and want to make sure I finish up in time for them to get started. So let's move on. I think I'll even skip this slide because they can cover it. Okay, so I wanted to talk just a little bit, particularly for those who are new to the board, about our programmatic environmental impact study process and where we are and what happens next. So the West LA Leasing Act, by its terms, requires VA to comply with all applicable environmental impact laws. It says that right in the statute. We can argue about whether the need for housing for homeless veterans should have been treated in such a way as to expedite that process is what it is. There are laws out there. Our statute says follow those laws, so we're following those laws. There are also different ways to follow those laws, some of them more expeditious but perhaps riskier from a litigation perspective, others perhaps more time consuming but less risky from a litigation perspective. The decisions about what process to use happened several years ago. I'm not actually the best person to speak to them because I wasn't in this role at the time, is what it is. And so we, in December of 2018, issued a draft statement that shows sort of all the studies that were done about the potential impact on traffic, noise, the historic elements on the property, a bunch of things that one is required to study in connection with any wholesale redevelopment. And then you have to make the results of those studies available to the public for their comments, and then their comments and some other things get built into the agency's final decision about how to go about the redevelopment at hand. For purposes of what's going on this campus, that encompasses not just housing on the North Campus, but also the plan to replace this hospital and all of the other health care buildings on the South Campus. Even those of you who have only come into town today, and if you've never been to LA, you know from today that traffic in these parts is pretty awful, as can be noise and congestion, and this is also a historic campus, so the potential for adverse impact to historic buildings and the historic district at large, the entire campus is a historic district. We have to look at all of those things, and we need to take into account the various options that have the least adverse impact from an environmental and historic perspective, and ultimately come up with a development scenario that is informed by all of that. So we are right now in the middle of our public comment period. We published the draft document in the Federal Register in December. We were asked over the holidays to extend the public comment period for a bunch of reasons. That's a good idea, if for no other reason than that a couple of the federal agencies that we expect to comment are actually subject to the government shutdown, and so they're not able to provide their comments yet. So we extended the public comment period into mid-February. We will have some public meetings next week to begin to take in new public comment, which can happen either through those meetings or through written submissions or both. And that then leaves us with additional information to consider as we determine which development scenarios are going to be the smartest and wisest ones to get us to the most rapid and cost-effective and least adversely impactful delivery of housing and other services for veterans on our campus. We are still, I hope, looking to issue a final document in late June or early July. I mentioned earlier that we've got one sort of open period for lawsuits coming up on the EAs for 205, 208, and 207. The issuance of that record of decision in connection with the PEIS is another opportunity for those who may seek to challenge our process or our decisions in court. So we'll all keep an eye on that. Obviously, we'll keep you informed as anything happens. Next slide, please. Wanted just to very briefly talk about the safe parking program. I think we had updated this group when that program was first piloted with 8 or 10 spaces in one parking lot. It was so successful, we've now expanded it to another parking lot that's fenced, it's larger, it has greater capacity. We are also, the folks who put on that program are partnering with other service providers to provide food in addition to a safe place to park and hygiene stations, and our homeless program folks go out and interact directly with the homeless veterans who are dwelling in their cars in that program to make sure they're connected to services that should result in a long-term housing plan. So it's been just a wonderful success. It seems so little and so obvious and so easy, and yet kind of across LA, the program's been having a bit of trouble finding property owners that are willing and able to provide a safe place for them to carry out their program. And I'm delighted that this campus is one of those places. Next up. Touched briefly about the interim bridge housing. As I said, that's a partnership between VA and the city and county. The city is paying to grade the site and place the structures. It will be 2 different housing structures, one for homeless veteran men and one for women. Must be a veteran to be in it, must be engaged in our services and leading to long-term housing. There also will be dining and shower and hygiene options. Again, seems like an obvious thing that should be happening across Los Angeles. The mayor has made it a priority to have one of these facilities in each of the city council districts, but it's hard to find property that is amenable to it. Fortunately, we have the space, and so we're moving toward it. We had a bit of a hiccup. It's an old campus, and not all of our mapping of underground utilities apparently is accurate. So as the city's contractor came out to grade the site, they hit a couple of water lines. And I think after the 4th thing they hit, we had to say, wait a minute, let's stop, take a knee, figure out what's under the ground. Because every time they hit a water main, we had to shut down service to the building that was served by that water main, and there were veteran services going on in those buildings, so it was not without disruption. But I believe they now have a plan, and we're still looking at, Heidi, are we looking at March or April?
Yes.
Okay, she says yes, March or April, operationally. We had hoped to open those in February, but as I said, we lost a couple of weeks while we figured out what was under the ground. Still will be a great success story, and also just kind of a lesson in what happens on a campus like this, where there have been buildings that have been moved and underground utilities that have been moved, and our records are not real great about what's where. Next slide, please. Wanted to touch at a high level about our process for determining when and under what circumstances third parties are going to come in and use VA space. I want to start at the highest level by reminding those of you who know and telling those of you who don't know that one of the recommendations in our IG audit report was for VA to coordinate with this group to ensure that those third-party land use decisions are made the right ways and are prioritizing the right things. And I think that is fabulous. I think the various perspectives around this table are going to absolutely help us make better decisions. So I also wanted to share with you kind of how those decisions have been made historically, so that as we work together to figure out what's the best way to plug you all in, you kind of have that baseline. So we have an office here called Asset Management, headed by Lori Moore, the lovely and talented Lori Moore over there. And that group has a land use advisory committee, something like that, that includes representatives from the VA police, facilities, safety, security, everybody who has anything to say about a proposed use of our land by a third party. And we have a process, there's an online form that people fill out saying what it is they want to do. If it's on this campus as opposed to our Sepulveda campus or anywhere else in the GLA system, it has to, any third-party land use must comply with the mandate in the draft master plan that it be veteran-centric, focused on meeting the needs of veterans. If it's a lease, then under the West LA Leasing Act, the standard is even higher. It must principally benefit veterans and their families. So we look first, Lori's team looks first at whether a proposed use meets that standard. Is it really focused on meeting the needs of veterans? That's threshold, because if the answer to that is no, we have to say no. Then the team looks at, assuming that threshold question had a yes answer, what is the level of impact on hospital operations or on the limited resources here of our police, our safety and security, our maintenance folks, our groundskeepers, whoever it may be, that will have to come in and support the requested land use. And there are times, frankly, when a requested use would benefit veterans, but the impact on hospital operations or on those limited resources is so high that we can't support it. And so I think we have been smart about our internal decision making and flawed in the way we communicate the results of it. We have tried, because there are so few people so far working on this stuff, we've tried to come up with one-size-fits-all messaging that frankly ends up not fitting anything. And it ends up in people being frustrated and feeling like they're being given an explanation that doesn't make any sense. And they're right. So we are working on fixing all that, being more forthcoming, starting with the explanation I just gave y'all, which is something may very well be a proposal that would benefit veterans, but GLA can't support it because of the amount of money we'd have to pay in police overtime or whatever it may be. And so that's been our process thus far. I look forward to working with this group, both to get additional input from veterans. What types of services on this campus would veterans prioritize highest, rather than who asked first? What are those priority needs for veterans? Those voices should be first and foremost in our ears as we're making these decisions. And then also I look forward to working with you all to find a way to make our process more transparent and rational, and our communications better as well. Opportunities to improve on all of this. Anthony, if you don't mind, I have one more slide to get through, and then I'd love to take questions.
That's fine.
If I were less loopy, I could adapt, but I'm a little loopy. Next slide, please. All right, this actually just goes over the process I just described. I do want to add, most of the things that happen in a large agency like this are subject to regulations. We do things by regulation. And in the regulations that apply to VA, the 38 CFR, there is a regulation that, it goes on for pages, and it talks about what facility directors are authorized to do. And among the things that facility directors are authorized to do is to say yay or nay to third-party use of their campuses. And so the work that Lori's committee does with the police input and the facilities input and maintenance input is that actually results in a recommendation that goes to our director. The recommendation is either yes or no, but it's ultimately the director's call. That's why we pay her the big bucks. To decide long-term how best to balance competing demands on the resources of the hospital, including space. And so those decisions are then made by the director. So I wanted to provide that context. I absolutely 100% agree with the IG. We have opportunities to improve the process, but I wanted to give you all the framework. This is how it has worked thus far. Now I'm ready to take questions.
Just John Hopper, just a couple things. With the way the timing is worked out in your presentation today for the committee, I'm considering postponing the next IPT update, which is scheduled for the 17th, which is a week from today, and picking up with our normal schedule, which would be the 30th of January. Think about that as we go forward. Now I forgot my second comment.
So I'm happy to make myself and the rest of the IPT members available whenever you want. Obviously, if there's an information need that's urgent that comes up between now and then, we can handle it.
Anthony Allman, could you describe the lease revenue fund, what it can be used for, what it can't be used for, and I don't know if you know the number off the top of your head, but how much money is currently in the lease revenue fund?
Sure. So under the normal course of things, before we had the West Los Angeles Leasing Act, when federal agencies lease their property and they get lease income, the ordinary course is it goes into the U.S. Treasury, mingled with all the rest of that money used for whatever. The West LA Leasing Act set up a different system, thank goodness, which says that lease revenues on this campus go into a special account that can only be used for the renovation and maintenance of the land and facilities here. I don't have the number off the top of my head in terms of how much has been collected thus far. It's several million. And we have conversations on a regular basis about what we should be using it for, with the caveat that we are at a point in the planning, particularly on the North Campus, that we don't know long-term where the roads necessarily are going to be, where the sidewalks are going to be. We don't know. There are some things that we know will stay, and those things need attention. Lots of things that it would frankly be a waste of money to spend a few $1 million fixing a sidewalk if that sidewalk's going to be gone in 2 years. One thing that we did identify as an obvious need is there's an overgrown and underutilized open space between the two domiciliary buildings that is uninviting to everyone except gophers. It's a colossal missed opportunity. And so earlier this past year, we engaged with UCLA, asked if they would provide pro bono the initial design services around creating a healing garden in that space that would be an extension of the DOM that would allow those folks who are going through residential treatments in the DOM to use that outdoor space as part of their healing process. So the first project that we plan to fund with those lease revenues is the build out of that healing garden between the two DOM buildings, because the DOM buildings will stay and the space between them needs to be part of the veterans' healing process while they're resident there.
And a follow-up, you mentioned the OIG report. The OIG report mentions several different types of land use agreements, short-term permits, revocable licenses, interagency agreements, MOUs, leases, and EULs. For the benefit of the full committee, can you maybe just touch on examples of those?
Sure. Let's start with the easy one. An EUL, an enhanced use lease, is the only mechanism that VA can use to provide housing. We don't have our own authority to provide housing. An enhanced use lease allows VA to partner with a developer and a private sector funding to renovate an underused building or to build on unused property housing, supportive housing for homeless veterans. So that's an EUL. Revocable licenses are by their very terms, they're revocable. They're a short term, although VA has often used them much longer than short term. They're supposed to be a short-term, non-recordable interest in real property. So if, for example, well, I'll use a good example. There has historically been a farmer's market that sets up outside the hospital on Wednesdays. And so that entity has exclusive use of that piece of property only on Wednesdays and only for a particular purpose. And we had to, I don't think we revoked it, I think we just moved them. But when the canteen here started construction or reconstruction or renovation, we moved the temporary kitchen into the space where the farmer's market had been. I think the farmer's market's just gonna set up somewhere else. But if the only thing to do had been to revoke that RL because we had a higher need, that's why you have a revocable license. We also have easements. Easements are generally, that's a legal concept that's generally used when somebody needs to pass over your land on their way to their own, or to come onto your land for purposes of doing something under it. So for example, well, the obvious thing in the West LA Leasing Act, there are 3 types of easements that are provided for in the West LA Leasing Act. The first one is an easement to a mass transportation entity to provide mass transportation onto and around the campus. So that's obviously, the drafters of the law knew that we were considering allowing the purple line to extend here. MOUs are generally not appropriate. My lawyers in the back of the room will do one of these if I get this wrong. That's something that you do if you have an agreement with somebody to provide service that isn't tied to a particular geographic location, not a particular building, not a particular room in a building, just something that in general a service provider comes on to do, and you need to set the rules for that engagement and arrangement. What were the other ones you wanted to get into?
So short-term permit, but I'm not sure if OIG used that interchangeably with a revocable license.
So one thing that the IG did recommend was that VA's Office of Real Property, which is part of the Construction and Facilities Management Office in DC, issue clearer policy around when to use what. The policy now is grossly unclear, and the practice across the entire system is all over the place. I have seen RLs that are 100 years. We had some on this campus that were 50. And yes, they were revocable at a moment's notice, but that's an odd use of that authority. And so one of the things that is supposed to happen as a result of the IG report is that VA policy office is supposed to issue clarified policy, and then GLA is supposed to make sure that all of our agreements comport with the clarified policy.
I have more questions, but I know we are short on time, so thank you.
Who's first? Jeff? Rob, go.
Hi, Rob Eglin for the record. Thank you. That was excellent, very informative. Wanted to ask you questions about kind of the temporary housing things you've identified. One was the safe parking program. The other was the partnership with the city for interim housing. So on the city program, could you just give us a little more details, like about the nature of the structures the city's going to put on the property, whether they're trailers, whether the size is comparable to other city projects, and what the duration of stay is for people who come into those facilities?
Heidi, do you want to come on up and hit those? It's Heidi's program, it's Heidi's brainchild, really just a testament to her great leadership, so I'd rather not get it wrong.
Megan, given your condition, can we hit anything that you can answer only, and then get you off stage and into a, an ambulance?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
but I just want to be mindful. So Heidi can probably answer a whole bunch of questions that we might have, and it's very informative, especially for new members. But let's just address things that only Megan can answer.
Hi, Megan. Jeff Shear for the record. Thank you for coming. 2 quick questions. Actually, hopefully they'll be quick. First, and this is for context of the new board members, we've discussed this in the past as a potential recommendation to Secretary of the VA around appropriating dollars for the redevelopment of this campus. And so just wanting to get a quick update on where we stand there, and knowing the complexity around continued resolutions and my limited understanding of the way government does finance, how can we get this campus appropriated, and what level of government do we need to push that up to?
Great question. Thank you for continuing to fight that fight for us. I think the most important thing for this board, and particularly the new members to be aware of, is the federal appropriations cycle. We are always operating 2 years ahead. So right now, I think VA just submitted the 2021 budget. And the other thing to keep in mind is that at least thus far, the Congressional Budget Office scores, identifies the cost to the government of any legislative change and also of any new budget initiative. And the practice for at least the past 6 or 8, maybe 10 years has been that any initiative that's going to cost money, any new initiative that's going to cost money, the agency proposing it must find a pay for some other previously appropriated initiative that it will forego in order to pay for the new one. So that's obviously in an effort to keep what had been an ever escalating federal debt deficit from continuing to escalate, but it makes life really complicated. So I think what this group, if you want to make a recommendation to our secretary around appropriating funds for the work that we're doing, you need to be aware that I think 2021 is already, the book is closed, unless there is some surplus that could be found in something that somebody already asked for and can't spend. And that we need to be mindful, and I'm not trying to be Debbie Downer, this is just, I learned the hard way. For those of you who don't know, born and raised in LA, I practiced law here for 20 years before I went to DC, thinking that I had lost all faith in the company that is the company town out here, and that it would be much more satisfying to work for the company town in DC. Boy, was I wrong. It's not just about how the sausage is made, it's just that the rules are crazy. Anyway, but I digress. So I think what you need to be aware of as you formulate that recommendation is where are we in the planning for which year's budget, and what is the mechanism historically for getting housing built through the EUL program. It does not rely on appropriated funds. However, our draft master plan is far more comprehensive and robust than just a few buildings being rehabbed. And a lot of the services and the activities that are contemplated in the draft master plan, I don't, as I'm sitting here, know how we would pay for those through the ordinary EUL program. They're not, a town center is not generally part of an EUL. And so I think ideally the recommendation would be around how to fund those things that don't fall neatly within either the EUL program or the major construction for the healthcare building south of Wilshire. There's an obvious way to pay for those two things. It's the stuff in between that is going to need some creativity and some appropriated dollars.
My second question, I'll keep this quick, is, and I promised you that I would continue to ask this, but the IG's report, where do we stand with a plan on how to address all of the recommendations that he had made in the timeline and when we can expect that plan?
So we are required to show compliance with the recommendations by September 30 of this year. However, the IG's practice is to require quarterly updates. So we're coming up on our first quarterly update. And that includes both a quarterly update on the redrafting of the policy to make it clear which type of land use agreement to use when, and also on the addressing of the particular issues raised with respect to particular land use agreements. We are drafting the first of those quarterly responses. I will share a little bit of our own sausage making because of the profile of the work that we're doing here, and because the IG's recommendations went to senior leadership in Washington, not to Ann or to me. We have to vet our proposed way ahead with respect to each of those land uses up to the people who signed off on the response who are in Washington, D.C. So we're in the midst of compiling our recommendations by land use agreement, so specifically, and then vetting those with those who have to say yep or no to our way ahead. And then once we have that way ahead, the hard work falls to us to renegotiate or terminate each of those land use agreements, or in one case, I think all we have to do is recharacterize. So one of the issues had to do with the Caltrans. What should have been an easement was drafted as an RL, and we just need to make it an easement. That's an easement. Right. Let's get that done. Why are you here? Go get that done. So I hope that helps. Anything else for me?
Okay, we're running out of time, so as quick as you can.
Yes, one question. Has there been any notification or do you have any progress on the funds that were confiscated, Richard Scott?
Sure. So for those who aren't familiar with the background, there was a criminal prosecution of one of our former lessees, contractors, who had underreported revenues and overreported expenses in connection with his operation of a parking lot business on our campus. He was sentenced. The sentencing included an order to provide restitution to the VA and also to forfeit some assets, 3 homes, some boats, some cars, some high-ticket assets. We had asked and received assurances from the Department of Justice that unlike the ordinary course of business, which has the proceeds of forfeited assets go into a particular forfeited assets fund that's administered by DOJ. In this case, because the restitution order named VA as the victim, we believe that the right thing to do is to have the forfeited assets go to satisfy the restitution order. Our colleague in Department of Justice agreed. Unfortunately, Department of Justice has been hit by the shutdown, so I don't think that's going to result in anything bad happening. It may simply delay the processing. We also have been in contact with some of our elected officials and their staffs to figure out whether we would need anything to happen to the West LA Leasing Act to in some way expand the definition of our lease revenues and the requirement that they stay here for the renovation and maintenance of this campus to include monies that come from forfeited assets. I mean, it would be cleaner if the statute said this is how you use them, but it's not always easy to get clean language out of Congress. So anyway, to answer your question, we're working it hard, we are paying attention. We've had all of the right responses from Department of Justice, which is delightful. I was afraid they were going to be the first ones to say, oh, hell no, but they didn't. So we're working.
Okay, let me cut that off there. Megan, thanks very much for your time, and well played in getting off the stage for Heidi. Okay, Heidi, don't get comfortable yet. You might sit back down. Director Brown has a comment that she needs to make.
One of the things that Megan discussed was land use on the campus. And I know there's been a lot of questions lately about veteran service organizations having meetings on our campus. So I just wanted to clarify, Megan referenced the CFR. What we're allowed to do on our campus is to support veteran service organizations as they work with veterans on their benefits, on their healthcare claims, and other advocacy activities. On the first floor, as you came through the main door of the hospital, as you came up the hall, you saw over to the right a veteran service organization room that houses VSOs who help veterans with their advocacy issues. We've also recently just started a program with the VBA right across the street where VBA employees are coming in and meeting with folks on our inpatient units to help them find out what services they have earned and increase their service connection if required. So we're working with VBA and the VSOs on those advocacy issues. What has come up is VSOs hosting meetings in our building, and that is not within the CFR. That is not something that we can support in hospital operations. So we work with our veteran service organizations to do the direct patient, veteran-centric work in the building. However, we're not able to host, and host meetings, business meetings for any of our VSOs.
And this is Jeff Shear. Sorry, shock. My follow-up would be outside of the hospital, say a VSO wants to do an event somewhere on this beautiful campus. What is that kind of approval process? Whose scope is that in? And in the future state, is that all through the hospital, or does that need to be managed by somebody else? Given that, I would imagine that level of complexity will increase, especially as 1,200 or more people are moved onto this campus.
So Megan also discussed Lori Moore's operation. So if any organization wants to do things on the campus, they can go through our land use approval process and go through that scenario that Megan explained. Thank you.
Just to be clear, is this a change in policy?
So, the CFR has not changed. As we have, I don't want to put this on the master plan, but as we have looked at the activities that are going on this campus, what you see in the IG report is a lot of changes that have occurred to ensure that what we are doing with land on this property is aligned with the very confusing methods of having revocable licenses, EULs. So there are things that have changed over the past several years. American Red Cross is leaving, the farmer's market is gone. Many things have changed as we have right-sized the Greater Los Angeles VA Medical Center. And so there are some changes, and frankly, there may be things that we still don't know about that can change. As we look through our records and find out what's going on this very large campus and this very large organization, I do not have 100% confidence we know everything that's occurring, and so more changes may come. But we have the processes set in place to ensure what we are doing on the campus does conform with the CFR, the regulations as we know them, and changes are continuing to occur.
Okay, unless anybody has a question for Heidi, I'm gonna ask you all to hold those in abeyance. Heidi, thanks very much. Our vice chair asked that we flash up one of the recommendations, just to give you a look at that now, because it does touch quite succinctly on an area we've been discussing about communication. So Chief, you could bring that up. What number is it in?
9 or 10.
Okay.
Which one specifically would you want to?
Let's look at 9. Can you bring up number 9, please?
Should I explain it?
Please.
So this recommendation centers around the need for improved communications on issues related to the draft master plan, both public notices and meetings. VA, GLA, or I should say much broader, VA has a contract with a company for software service called Granicus. They have a product called Gov Delivery. GLA uses this product. Every VA medical center uses this product. It's available on the VA West LA front page. Chief, if you could pull up the website, please, losangeles.va.gov. The problem now is that if you attend a master plan event and you use the sign-in sheet, a lot of people have come to master plan events, a lot of people have signed into the sign-in sheet, but yet they don't receive emails from the master plan email address. We did an audit. It's in our supporting documentation book of all the master plan notices that went out from the master plan email address, and none of those have appeared on the front page of the Los Angeles GLA website, which we think is a missed opportunity for outreach. So if you go to losangeles.va.gov, rather than having people sign in here, sign in there, fill out this form, we think the best approach is to have sort of a unified funnel, right? Where if they want updates, losangeles.va.gov. If you want updates not only on the master plan, but if the secretary comes to town, or
So, yes, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know what this is, not heard about it.
Wait.
it's on the front page.
Yeah, we're not,
But-
we're not gonna
Okay.
discuss this.
Yeah, that's good.
So, in the interest of time, we want to do a better job of communicating. If Gracias Go development is the way to go, so be it. We're in.
Okay, great. Let's move on. We're 20 minutes behind on the principal developer briefing. If you need a break, take a break on your own. Principal developer, you're up.